Welcome to Lecture 8, Quantitative Evidence on Impacts and Social Feasibility of Reforms. The previous lecture demonstrated that basic income is affordable, progressive, and produces substantial health benefits. This lecture now asks the political question, even if we know it works, can it be done? It takes the evidence produced in the previous two lectures and asks whether the public would actually support it, and if not, why not? And what evidence would change that? This lecture has three distinct intellectual contributions. First, it provides the most empirically grounded diagnosis of why transformative redistributive policy struggles politically, not as a vague claim about public opinion, but through a specific psychological mechanism called the political cycle of depression. Second, it introduces conjoint analysis as the methodological answer to the limitations of traditional polling, using a survey experiment with 800 British residents. Third, it describes the Triple PC, the Public Policy Preference Calculator, which integrates the conjoint findings with the microsimulation and health modelling of previous lectures into a single interactive model publicly available at tripplepc.northumbria.ac.uk. The lecture's central empirical finding is also its most politically important. Contrary to the assumptions of Westminster politicians and most political commentators, the British public is substantially more favourable to redistributive government action than the current political settlement implies. We cover 10 topics structured around a central argument: that the gap between what the evidence shows is possible and what politicians believe is politically feasible is not a fact of nature. It is an empirical claim that can be tested and challenged. The first two topics examine why that gap exists. The next three develop and apply the methodological tools for testing it. Topics 7 through 9 explain the technical machinery of the Triple PC. The final topic draws the lessons. This lecture sits at the junction between technical evidence production and political communication. Everything in the previous lectures was about producing rigorous evidence. This lecture is about why that evidence alone is insufficient, and what additional analytical tools are needed to connect evidence to political action. The next lecture completes this argument by introducing adversarial co-production of narratives. We open this lecture with an apparently paradoxical finding from Bartram's analysis of 40 years of World Values Survey data. Despite sustained economic growth in the UK, life satisfaction in 2018 was not significantly higher than it was in recession-hit 1981. The mechanism is inequality. Growth that disproportionately benefits the top of the distribution does not improve the lived experience of those in the middle and lower parts, because the social determinants of well-being depend on relative position as well as absolute income level. The mental health dimension is particularly important for understanding the political failure of redistribution. The evidence establishes bidirectional causality. Lower socioeconomic status causes anxiety and depression then reduce income, creating a compounding cycle. This is not merely a medical observation. It has direct political consequences through what Ojeda calls the political cycle of depression. The cycle is precise. Individuals with depression are less likely to participate in the political process. Their underrepresentation means that policies benefiting them are less likely to be adopted. The absence of beneficial policies perpetuates their depression. The cycle repeats. This mechanism helps explain why the communities most harmed by inequality and insecurity have not translated that harm into consistent political pressure for redistribution. The very conditions that make redistribution necessary also undermine the political capacity to demand it. The Brexit and Trump connection is empirically grounded, not rhetorical. Psychological traits associated with anxiety and depression predicted support for Leave and Trump in 2016. Bernardi and Johns offer one explanation. Those with depressive traits prefer the politics of least upheaval and shifted to Leave post-referendum to make the issue go away. This creates a fundamental tension. Those who need the change most may psychologically resist the uncertainty that change requires. Understanding this tension is the precondition for addressing it. There are three barriers to redistribution, and they are not rhetorical. They are measurable, documented features of the political landscape that explain why politicians consistently underestimate public support for redistribution. The first barrier is differential participation. The constituencies most harmed by inequality are systematically less likely to engage with the political process for precisely the mental health reasons the previous slide established. This is not a fixed feature of human nature. It is a consequence of the material conditions that redistribution would address. The second barrier is the interests of those in power. The textbook cites evidence that policymakers are disproportionately wealthy, placing them in the category of those who would personally lose out from significant redistribution. The evidence on concern for relative gains is relevant here. Voters and policymakers alike are less likely to support policies that impose a personal net loss to achieve gains for others. Okification is the political risk that follows from accommodating these barriers rather than addressing them. Named after the Greek Social Democratic Party that collapsed after supporting austerity, it describes the pattern in which progressive parties lose their base by failing to offer the redistributive policies their constituents need. The Labour Party's post-2019 strategy of avoiding radical redistribution in favour of English identity politics is analysed in the textbook as a form of this accommodation, and the evidence from our surveys directly challenges the premise that red wall voters oppose redistribution. 75% approval for basic income in those constituencies is not a marginal majority. It is a substantial one, and it persists even among 2019 Conservative voters. The embedded YouTube video examines the broader effects of inequality on the viability of democratic government. The Social Democratic Party, SDP, Liberal Alliance. Dead Parrot example is the most effective illustration of the problem the Triple PC is designed to solve. In January 1988, the party's merger manifesto proposed abolishing child benefit and extending VAT to food and children's clothing to fund an anti-poverty programme. The distributional economics were sound and had been modelled carefully. But MPs were terrified of the electoral consequences, and the manifesto was abandoned within a single day. The resulting chaos contributed to the long-term decline of the centre ground in UK politics. The VAT zero rating for food and children's clothing remains politically untouchable to this day, not because the economic argument against it has improved, but because no one has produced the kind of integrated electoral and distributional evidence that would allow politicians to assess the real trade-offs. The Triple PC was built to fill exactly this gap. Its logic is that policymakers face three interconnected questions simultaneously. What does this reform cost and who gains? What does it do to health outcomes? And will the public support it? These three questions have traditionally been addressed separately by different research teams using different methods, producing outputs that cannot be directly compared or combined. The Triple PC integrates all three into a single model with a single user interface. The web interface is worth emphasizing as a design choice with political implications. By making the model publicly available at tripplepc.northumbria.ac.uk, anyone, a think tank researcher, a civil servant, a journalist, a campaigner, can configure a welfare reform package and immediately see its distributional impact, its estimated health effects, and its predicted electoral popularity relative to the baseline. This democratizes access to the kind of integrated analysis that was previously available only to well-resourced institutions with dedicated modelling capacity. The methodological case for conjoint analysis over traditional polling rests on a specific limitation of standard welfare preference surveys. If you ask people in isolation whether they support higher public spending, most say yes. If you ask them whether they support lower taxes, most also say yes. These are not contradictory positions when the questions are asked separately, but they cannot both be true when resources are constrained. Traditional polling cannot force respondents to confront this tension. Conjoint analysis does. The 10 attributes cover the full range of features that might make a welfare reform more or less attractive. How generous the payments are, what income tax rates are required, whether the funding comes from wealth taxes, carbon taxes, borrowing, or other sources, and what happens to poverty, inequality, life expectancy, and rates of anxiety and depression. By varying all 10 attributes simultaneously and randomly, the experiment generates thousands of different policy combinations across the 800 respondents' 15 choice tasks each. The critical methodological insight is randomization of attribute levels. In the real world, generous payments and high taxes are positively correlated. Big payments cost money. In the experiment, they are orthogonal. Some configurations show high payments funded by wealth taxes, others by borrowing, others by income tax, and the tax rates vary independently of the payment levels. This orthogonality is what allows the average marginal component effect, AMCE, estimation to separate the marginal effect of each attribute from all the others. The AMCE is the standard statistic in conjoint analysis, measuring the average change in the probability of a policy being chosen that results from changing one attribute while all other attributes are held constant. The AMCE has a precise interpretation. The marginal effect on the probability of choosing a policy of changing one attribute from its reference level, averaging across all possible combinations of the other attributes. If the AMCE for poverty decreased by 50% is positive 0.15, that means including a 50% poverty reduction in a policy package increases the probability of that package being chosen by 15 percentage points, on average, across all the other attribute combinations. This makes AMCEs directly comparable across very different attributes. You can compare how much poverty reduction matters versus how much it costs to lose a 10 percentage point income tax increase. The embedded YouTube video outlines conjoint analysis in greater detail. The headline finding from the conjoint experiment is the one most important for public and political communication. Poverty reduction is the dominant driver of welfare policy preference, and it dominates to a degree that substantially offsets tax evasion. This is the finding that most directly challenges the Westminster assumption that redistributive taxation is electorally toxic. The conditionality of tax preferences is the analytically important nuance. The same income tax increase, say raising the basic rate from 20% to 30%, is valued positively when it is accompanied by a substantial poverty reduction, and negatively when poverty is unchanged. Tax evasion is not a fixed preference that policymakers face as an immovable constraint. It is a conditional preference that depends on what the tax is funding and what it achieves. This is a directly policy-relevant finding. A tax increase that is presented in isolation as an economic necessity will face predictable opposition. The same tax increase, framed as the price of dramatic poverty reduction, faces substantially less opposition. The funding source finding is particularly relevant to current UK political debate. The Labour government ruled out a wealth tax in 2023 on the grounds of political unfeasibility. The conjoint evidence shows that wealth taxes are actually preferred by respondents over increased government borrowing as a funding mechanism. The political analysis, that a wealth tax is unacceptable to voters, is simply not supported by the evidence. Other recent polling on wealth taxes in the UK shows the same pattern: high public support that is consistently underestimated by policymakers. The intuitive Rawlsian finding is theoretically significant. The dominant preference for poverty reduction, for the welfare of the worst off is consistent with what Rawls described as the Maximin criterion. Maximize the minimum, ensuring the worst off are as well off as possible. But respondents are not strictly Rawlsian. They also care about inequality beyond the poverty line and about health consequences, particularly for large changes in either direction. The complete Rawlsian indifference to what happens above the poverty line is not what the evidence shows. The poverty tax trade-off visualization is the most compelling single analytical output from the conjoint experiment, and it is worth explaining carefully because it communicates something politicians frequently assert is impossible to demonstrate empirically. For each of the 77 possible combinations of the 6 income tax rate options and the 10 poverty outcome levels, the analysis computes the net AMCE, the sum of the AMCE for that income tax combination and the AMCE for that poverty outcome, relative to the status quo combination of current tax rates and current poverty levels. A positive net AMCE means that combination would be more popular than the status quo. A negative net AMCE means less popular. The result is striking. There is a clear diagonal zone across the trade-off space where net preferences are positive. These are the combinations where income tax increases are paired with substantial poverty reductions. Even very high rates, a 50% basic rate, 70% higher rate, 80% additional rate, fall inside this zone if the poverty reduction is large enough. This is not a finding that most Westminster politicians or political commentators would expect. The received wisdom is that income tax increases are always electoral liabilities. The evidence is that they are only liabilities if they do not deliver visible improvements in living standards. The partisan comparison adds important nuance without undermining the core finding. Conservative voters are more tax-averse than Labour voters, and they do not accept the very highest rates even with complete poverty elimination. But the key finding is that even Conservative voters would accept income tax rates considerably above current levels. A basic rate of 40%, higher rate of 60%, additional rate of 70%, if these produced large poverty reductions. There is a substantial shared zone of acceptable policies across partisan lines. This is the evidence base for arguing that progressive fiscal reform is not electorally impossible. It is simply not how such reform has been framed and communicated. The health strand of the PPPC uses the same within-between modelling framework as the Lecture 7 health microsimulation. Rather than repeating the full explanation of the methodology, let me focus on what is distinctive about its application in the PPPC context. The key difference between the health modelling in Lecture 7 and its use in the PPPC is scope. In Lecture 7, the health modelling was applied to 3 carefully designed basic income schemes at specific payment levels. In the PPPC, the model must respond to any policy combination that a user might choose from the conjoint compatible menu of options. This means the health predictions must be computed on the fly from the regression coefficients rather than from pre-computed scenario runs. The responsiveness limitation is important to acknowledge honestly to users of the PPPC. For the income changes involved in the conjoint compatible policy options, which are much smaller in aggregate than the Lecture 7 schemes, mental health shows relatively modest responses. A package costing £430 billion reduces the proportion of adults with critically low SF12 scores by only about 3%. This is not because the income-health relationship is weak at the individual level. The UK HLS evidence establishes that it is real and significant. It is because the redistribution involved, spread across the entire adult population, produces income changes for most individuals that are relatively modest in the context of their overall life circumstances. This is a genuine limitation of the PPPC's health modelling that we need to be transparent about. The model is better at demonstrating the feasibility of the economic case than at producing precise health impact estimates for arbitrary policy combinations. For the latter purpose, the dedicated analysis in Lecture 7, with its carefully validated scheme designs and bootstrapped confidence intervals, provides more reliable estimates. The technical architecture of the Triple PC reflects a series of difficult methodological choices that the textbook documents honestly. Understanding these choices is important for interpreting the model's outputs correctly. The most consequential choice is the baseline. Unlike a standard microsimulation that compares a reform against the current UK tax benefit system, the Triple PC must use a hypothetical baseline because the conjoint experiment did not include a keep things as they are option for its tax and benefit inputs. The survey presented respondents with modified systems from the outset, so the reference point for the conjoint AMCEs is not the current system, but the first, most modest option in each attribute's range. The specific baseline chosen, adult payments of £63 per week, pensioner payments of £190 per week, no child payments, funded by borrowing, at current income tax rates, is described in the textbook as the least bad option. It costs £108 billion net at baseline, mainly due to the adult payments. And because it abolishes child benefit while providing nothing for children at the baseline, families with children are actually worse off at the baseline than under the current system. This means that a user who selects higher child payments in the Triple PC is not choosing higher payments than the current system. They are choosing higher payments than the already modified baseline, which itself has worse child poverty than the current UK system. All Triple PC outputs must be interpreted relative to this starting point, not relative to the current system. This is explicitly flagged in the textbook as a lesson for future work. The 5-stage model flow is straightforward to describe but complex to implement. Parameter selection drives a household-level calculation of net incomes under the chosen policy configuration, which then feeds into the health regressions, which then feeds into the distributional analysis, which then feeds into the conjoint AMCEs for a popularity estimate. The entire process runs in seconds on the web interface, allowing iterative policy design in real time. The lessons learned section of this lecture is one of the most valuable parts of the course, because it models something that academic papers rarely do: an honest, systematic account of what went wrong in a major research project and what should be done differently next time. The first lesson, coordinate conjoint and microsimulation from the outset, seems obvious in retrospect but is not. The conjoint experiment was conducted first, which was a reasonable sequencing decision given that public opinion data takes time to collect and analyse. But it meant that the microsimulation had to be designed around the constraints of the survey instrument, rather than the survey being designed to maximise what the microsimulation could reveal. The Qualtrics platform had a hard limit on the number of attributes that could be included. This prevented the conjoint from asking about basic and higher tax rates individually, creating an artificial constraint that propagated through the entire model. The conclusion connects the technical findings to a political argument that echoes the introduction. Hayek's prediction that the post-war welfare state would lead to communism and the end of democracy was empirically false. Every important outcome improved between 1945 and the 1970s. The rolling back of the state since 1979 has not produced freedom. It has produced deindustrialization, infrastructure decay, and unprecedented financial insecurity among working-age adults, particularly outside London and the South East. The YouGov 2025 data cited in the conclusion is striking. The Labour government, committed to not raising taxes and not expanding public services in ways the public actually want, has become deeply unpopular precisely because it has tied itself to a political analysis of public preferences that the evidence in this lecture directly contradicts. The basic elements of the economic and health evidence produced in this course need to be connected to public opinion evidence, which this lecture does, and then to effective narrative and communication, which the next lecture addresses. Without all three, evidence will not move policy. This exercise asks you to translate the policy you have been modelling into a form that can be put to the public. That translation is harder than it sounds. The choice of attributes is the most consequential design decision. A full factorial design, all possible combinations of 4 attributes with 5 levels each, would produce 5 to the power of 4 equals 625 profiles, far too many for any single respondent. Fractional factorial designs select a subset of combinations that preserve the ability to estimate main effects. The wording of each level is critical. A reduction in child poverty of 10 percentage points is precise but requires a clear baseline. High income tax is accessible but ambiguous. Draft your survey and consider the following. Would the average British citizen understand the attribute descriptions without explanation? The PPPC takes the microsimulation evidence from the previous lectures and adds a new dimension. It tells you not just what your policy does, but whether people would vote for it. The popularity score is expressed as a deviation from the baseline. A positive score means the policy combination is more popular than the baseline. The components of the score, which attributes are adding to or subtracting from popularity, are shown separately. Please go to pppc.northumbria.ac.uk and systematically vary one attribute at a time and observe the effect on popularity. You will find that large adult payments are popular but expensive. High income tax is unpopular. Poverty reduction is popular. Health improvements are popular but add less to the score than poverty reduction. Remember the baseline limitation discussed in the lecture. All PPPC results are relative to a starting point that differs from the actual current UK system. The direction of the popularity effects is informative. The absolute numbers should be interpreted cautiously. The title of this conclusion, "The Evidence Exists, the Gap is Political, Not Analytical," is the strongest claim this course makes, and it belongs at the end because it only makes sense after 8 lectures of evidence. By the end of this lecture, you have, collectively, a measurement framework for poverty and inequality, Lecture 4, a microsimulation model calculating who gains and loses from any fiscal reform, Lectures 5 and 6, a health model translating income gains into prevented depression cases, QALYs, and NHS savings, Lecture 7, and a public opinion instrument calculating the popularity of any policy configuration across partisan lines, this lecture. The gap between the evidence and the policy is not a gap in analytical infrastructure. It is a gap in political will and political communication. The first thread is the social feasibility problem. Bartram's finding that UK life satisfaction in 2018 was similar to 1981, despite decades of growth, is the empirical anchor. 5 decades of trickle-down policy have not delivered the promised gains at the bottom. The depression non-participation cycle Ojeda describes is a structural feature of a high inequality society. Lower SES voters who would benefit most from redistribution are systematically less likely to vote. Policymakers are disproportionately well off. Battleground constituencies are older and more asset-rich. These are structural barriers, but not insuperable, because the conjoint evidence shows the Overton window is substantially wider than the political class currently operates inside. The second thread is conjoint analysis as the right method for measuring political feasibility. Single question polling asks whether someone supports a policy. It cannot tell you whether they support it when it comes with a tax increase or whether they prefer it funded by a wealth tax rather than borrowing. Conjoint analysis forces trade-offs. The average marginal component effect measures the causal impact on probability of choice of changing one attribute, averaging across all others. The correlation between tax rates and poverty outcomes that exists in the real world is removed in the experiment, so their independent effects can be estimated. This is the measurement approach that policy analysis has been missing. The third thread is what the conjoint findings show. Poverty reduction is the dominant driver of policy choice, stronger than tax levels, inequality, or health outcomes. Income tax increases are popular when they reduce poverty and unpopular when they do not. Wealth taxes, carbon taxes on corporations, and corporation tax increases are all preferred to government borrowing. Even conservative voters accept income tax rates considerably above current levels when the accompanying poverty reduction is large. There is a substantial zone of policies popular across partisan lines. The government's commitment not to do the things the public want is not a response to public opinion. It is a misreading of it. The fourth thread is the triple PC as integrated infrastructure. The three strands, conjoint, health model, and microsimulation, are each independently valuable. Together they are qualitatively more powerful. A policymaker using the tool simultaneously sees the fiscal cost, the distributional pattern, the health returns, and the popularity score for any configuration. That integration is what the dead parrot problem requires, not just distributional analysis, and not just polling, but a system in which the analyst can show a politician that a policy is affordable, effective, and popular, adjusting parameters in real time to find the combination that maximizes all three. The fifth thread is the lessons, because they matter beyond the triple PC. Co-design the conjoint survey and microsimulation from the outset. Conducting the conjoint experiment first constrained the policy space in ways co-design would have avoided. Define the baseline as the current system. The triple PC baseline is a hypothetical that makes every result relative to something that has never existed. Coordinate uncertainty, quantification across all three strands. Bootstrapping the health model understates total uncertainty if the microsimulation and conjoint results are not also reported with their own uncertainty ranges. These are not failures. They are the product of building a genuinely novel integrated system under real-world constraints. The next iteration will be better, and you now have the knowledge to build it. This is the final lecture of the course. When you upload your course report to the Open Science Framework, it will be publicly citable, demonstrating that you can build an evidence base, interpret it honestly, and situate it in a policy and political context. That is the capability this course was designed to produce. The evidence for transformative policymaking now exists. The task is to use it